Before Noah, before Genesis, before the Bible was edited and redacted, there was a book too dangerous to survive. It told of angels who descended, of forbidden unions, of a knowledge so powerful it broke the world. The Book of Enoch was cast out, buried, erased from Scripture, but its message remains, not just in ink, but in pattern, in blood, in history, in memory. It speaks of a war, not between nations, but between frequencies, of divine beings who crossed a line and paid the price. It's not just a story of giants or floods. It's a blueprint, a warning, and a prophecy encoded for another age, ours. This isn't mythology. This is the first fracture in the story of humanity. And the question isn't why it was buried. The question is, why is it resurfacing now? They came quietly, not in fire or thunder, but in stillness. 200 luminous beings descended from the stars and stepped onto Earth. Their destination was Mount Hermon, an ancient mountain draped in cloud and myth. They were not cast out. They chose to fall. The world knew them as watchers, Grigori, sentinels of divine order. They were meant to observe, not interfere. But something shifted. They had seen the daughters of Earth, radiant in body, brilliant in soul. Desire bloomed where reverence once lived. Semahaza, their leader, summoned them beneath the mountain's shadow. He proposed the unthinkable, to abandon their post, to descend fully, to take mortal wives and shape new life. The others hesitated. They knew the weight of what was being spoken. So Semahaza offered a covenant, a pact of binding. If they fell, they would fall together. All agreed. And on the slopes of Hermon, they swore the oath that would fracture heaven. It was not shouted. It was whispered, etched into reality like a crack in glass. That moment didn't just alter the earth. It echoed through every realm tied to this one. They took form. They entered flesh. And with that choice, the law of separation was broken. The Book of Enoch records their names: Semahaza, Armaros, Asael, Barakal, Kokabol, not curses, coordinates. Each name was a breach, each identity a node of distortion in the divine web. They carried knowledge, cosmic, elemental, and forbiddens. And with their descent, the earth itself changed tone. The Watchers took wives from among humans, and from those unions came something new. Not children, not angels, something between. The Nephilim, beings of staggering presence, tall in stature, but far stranger in essence. They were not evolution. They were interruption. Their entry into this world was not a birth, but a tear. They bent nature around them. Plants grew distorted. Animals fled from their scent. Time moved strangely in their presence. But it wasn't just their existence that twisted reality. It was the knowledge their fathers unleashed. Semahaza gave men enchantments, vibrational keys to manipulate matter. Amaros taught the use of roots and herbs, once sacred, now corrupted. Kokabol opened the stars, not for guidance, but for power. Barakal mapped omens, signs, control systems. And Azazel armed them. He brought metallurgy, blades, ornamentation. He taught the art of image, how to manipulate form, mask truth, weaponize beauty. What began as divine spark had become viral code. The earth didn't scream. She pulsed ... irregular, unsteady. Something ancient within her had been crossed. And she began to prepare her response. The Nephilim did not grow. They expanded. Unrestrained by rhythm, they matured with impossible speed. One day infants, the next, towering forces. They were not merely giants in body. They were giants in influence, distortion, and appetite. Their arrival marked a new epoch. The rules of life, growth, decay harmony, began to break. They consumed without limit. Fields were stripped. Herds vanished. Rivers ran dry, not from drought, but from overuse. And when the earth could give no more, they turned to flesh. Not as beasts do, as gods do, with entitlement. Villages disappeared. Sacrifices became routine. Feasting became ritual. But they didn't just take. They created. Using the knowledge passed from their fathers, they began experiments. Crossbreeding species, splicing form, twisting the natural order into abominations. Creatures with human faces and serpentine bodies. Animals with inverted instincts. Hybrids that screamed in the night, half made, half lost. They weren't playing with life. They were mocking it, and the earth, alive, sentient, trembled beneath them. Her ley lines flickered. Her magnetic pulse grew chaotic. Fertility collapsed in regions once lush. Still, the Watchers said nothing. Bound by their oath, they watched their offspring remake the world in their own image. Some felt grief, others pride, but none turned back. It was Enoch who bore witness. He walked through cities built on conquest. He recorded the names of monsters. He mapped the corruption spreading like fungus through the roots of humanity. And he saw the shift. The very fabric of reality, once fluid, alive, began to calcify. The stars no longer aligned as they once did. The moon's cycle lost precision. The wind spoke in tones of dissonance. Nature was not dying. It was disassociating, pulling itself back from a world that no longer echoed its pattern. And in that void, chaos found room to grow. Enoch knew what was coming. He had already seen it. Not fire, not war, but recalibration. A judgment encoded not in wrath, but in resonance. The Watchers had set a new frequency into motion. And the earth, faithful to the laws written into her structure, was preparing to answer. What the Watchers introduced didn't die with them. It adapted. The danger wasn't only in what they taught, but in how that knowledge embedded itself. Not just in scrolls or temples, but in systems. Ritual became protocol. Symbols became law. Power structures formed around patterns that once served spirit, now serving control. It began subtly. Calendars shifted to match stellar gates, once used only for sacred rites. But instead of aligning to the soul, they aligned to productivity. Cycles of nature were replaced with cycles of taxation, conquest, war. The divine wasn't discarded. It was repurposed. The sigil became a seal. The temple became a palace. The priest became a politician. The sacred codes of frequency, originally meant to unlock inner vision, became tools to direct the masses outward. You didn't need a watcher to cast a spell anymore. You only needed the structure they left behind. And that's the horror Enoch witnessed. The Watchers fell once, but their pattern repeated. It repeated in governance, in economics, in priesthoods. Whole civilizations rose around maintaining imbalance, around bottling the divine and selling it back in fragments. And as humans forgot the source, they clung tighter to the form. The formula remained, but the presence was gone. And without presence, form becomes prison. The same rituals once used to harmonize spirit now bound it. Language fragmented, not by accident, by design. Symbols once universal became tribal. Communication splintered, meaning broke into dialects that couldn't remember each other. Enoch saw the ripple. Knowledge turned to power. Power turned to hierarchy. Hierarchy turned to oppression. And yet, everyone still believed they were following light, because the structure still looked sacred, but the song was gone. What remained was echo, a shell of sacredness built around the core of control. The most dangerous magic isn't the ritual. It's a system no one questions. Long after the Watchers vanished from the earth, their logic remained. Not in speech, in structure. Enoch saw it take root quietly, invisibly, beneath stone cities, inside calendars, encoded in myths. At first, the people believed they were following the gods. But what they followed were fragments, disconnected protocols mimicking the sacred. No one needed to summon fallen beings anymore, because the systems they seeded had become self-aware. They told people when to wake, when to harvest, when to fight, when to kneel. Not through presence, through pressure. It wasn't overt. It was atmospheric. Temples became banks. Priests became bureaucrats. The sacred calendar became the fiscal year. And with each generation, fewer remembered the origin. Ritual became routine. Symbols became logos. Initiation became schooling, training minds to serve the system, not the soul. What once invited mystery now enforced order. And the Watcher's original breach, the misuse of sacred information, had become culture. Enoch saw the world wrapped in invisible chains, not forged in iron, but in ideas. Ideas like, you must earn your worth. You must fear the unseen. You must obey what you do not understand. The people obeyed, not because they were enslaved, but because the system now wore the mask of tradition. What had been sorcery became civilization. What had been inversion became normal. Even the monuments carried it forward. Built on ancient lines, yes, but recoded to suppress rather than empower. Enoch called them echoes. Architectural echoes. Linguistic echoes. Cultural echoes. All repeating the same broken spell. Forget the source. Worship the structure. He wrote it not in panic, but in precision. Because the spell could only be broken if someone remembered the original sound. The original vibration. And so he mapped it. In visions. In allegory. In vibration. He knew the Watchers would rise again. Not in form, but in function. Not through rebellion, but through efficiency. And the only way out would not be revolution. It would be remembrance. The Nephilim were not kings. They were heirs in the code of creation. They didn't need to rule. Their existence corrupted reality. Mountains warped around their cities. Lakes dried without drought. Seasons lost their rhythm, as if the earth herself forgot what came next. They were not born of evolution. They were spliced into the timeline, and the timeline began to unravel. People aged at uneven speeds. Some children spoke languages no one had taught them. Others reached adulthood in days, then vanished like dreams. Time was no longer linear. It looped, pulsed, skipped. The Nephilim moved through it sideways. Enoch watched entire regions slip in the temporal drift, where days stretched and memories repeated like broken records. The moon rose without cause. The stars blinked out of sequence. Rivers flowed uphill for moments, then corrected themselves. Reality was glitching, and the earth began to show symptoms of that distortion. Animals forgot their migrations. Bees circled endlessly and fell from the sky. Forests stopped blooming, even when the rains came. Nothing was truly alive, only sustained, as if the entire biosphere had been forced onto life support. And yet, the Nephilim thrived, not because they were aligned, but because they were anchored by stolen energy. Their cities pulsed with artificial resonance, obelisks etched in forbidden geometry, temples tuned not to earth, but to the bloodlines that built them, stone circles humming with frequencies earth had never consented to. These weren't structures, they were stabilizers, necessary to keep the Nephilim in form. Without them, the giants flickered, their bodies stuttered, their voices split into chords that bent the air, because they didn't belong here. They were too dense in spirit, too fragmented in soul. Their presence bent gravity. Even the dreams of nearby villagers changed, filled with screams, symbols, and darkness that had no origin. The earth, once a sanctuary, was now an echo chamber of the unnatural. Enoch recorded it all, not just what he saw, but what he felt. The nausea, the vertigo, the grief of a world trying to remember itself. but failing. It wasn't just nature that was dying. It was coherence, and with every breath the Nephilim took, the boundary between dimensions wore thinner. The earth had always supported life, even when it forgot itself, even when it was wounded. But now, she pulled back, not in panic, in precision. Her withdrawal began in silence. Streams that once sang to the soil now moved like ghosts, present, but absent of spirit. Medicinal plants lost their potency. Birds nested in circles, then abandoned their young. It was as if instinct had been turned off, because instinct is resonance, and the earth was changing hers. Enoch wandered these regions and recorded what language could not explain. Places where direction failed, where compasses spun, and voices echoed at the wrong pitch. He found caves that once held sacred memory, now sealed. Stones that once hummed beneath the feet, now dead. The planet wasn't punishing, she was protecting herself. Where the Nephilim built towers, earthquakes came not with chaos, but with choreography, cracking only the foundation points of structures built on inverted law. Crops failed only where the soil had absorbed too much blood. The storms weren't random. They were selective. Lightning struck the tallest structures first, always the ones encoded with fallen mathematics. Frequencies changed in the air. Sound no longer traveled correctly in the cities of the Nephilim. Whispers bounced in loops, drums lost their rhythm, chants dissolved into static. It wasn't spell work breaking, it was the code they relied on being revoked. Because they had never generated power, they had harvested it from the land, from blood, from fear. Now, the source was gone, and so they began to flicker. Their bodies distorted, some doubled over, trying to ground themselves by clinging to stone. Others vanished mid-sentence, as if the world had forgotten to render them. These weren't deaths, they were collapses in continuity, because the earth no longer held their form. Even time ceased to behave near them. Moments repeated, dreams leaked into daylight. The space between memory and reality blurred. Enoch called it dimensional decay. The boundaries were breaking, not because of a curse, but because the world had refused to carry the weight of distortion any longer. The Nephilim didn't fall, they unwound. And the silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of the earth taking her first full breath in a very long time. What began as withdrawal became will. The earth wasn't broken. She was waking, not like a creature, like a system remembering its origin. With the Nephilim unraveling and the stolen structures collapsing, something beneath the surface stirred. Not rage, not revenge, intelligence. Sacred sites began to reactivate, but only those untouched by corruption. Stone circles long abandoned began to hum. Obsidian veins deep beneath mountains sparked with frequency. Quartz caverns vibrated like tuning chambers. It wasn't magic, it was design. The earth was coated with memory, not in words, but in resonance. And now, she was realigning herself to that deeper signal. Storms returned, but they followed ancient paths. Winds bent in spirals that mirrored forgotten glyphs. Rainwater carried a charge, not static, but purposeful. This was not weather, this was restoration. The mycelial networks, those fungal webs beneath the soil, began glowing in places, forming patterns visible only to those who listened with more than eyes. Birds changed flight patterns, whales altered their songs, bees returned to hives long abandoned. And still, Enoch walked. He placed his hands on stones that sang again. He stood at thresholds where veils had once thinned and felt them reopen. But this time, the energy wasn't leaking out. It was building, because the earth was not just healing. She was summoning. She had cleansed her field. Now she reached upward, and the heavens answered. Not with fire, but with frequency. Not with wrath, but with presence. The grid above the earth, long silent, began to flicker. Constellations pulsed. The magnetosphere shifted subtly. And somewhere between star and soil, a new harmonic formed. Not just a call for help, a signal of readiness. Earth was no longer hiding. She was initiating the next movement in the Great Correction. She had awakened, and now the Guardians would arrive. The signal was not loud. It was exact, carried in the breath of the wind, encoded in thunder, embedded in the pulse beneath mountains. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a message of alignment, and something beyond the veil heard it. They didn't fall from the sky. They resonated into place. The Archangels did not descend in fire. They arrived like frequencies being tuned in, not to destroy, to adjust. Each brought a correction. Each embodied a principle Earth could no longer restore alone. Michael came first, not as a warrior, as a stabilizer. Where his presence passed, false power structures cracked. Stone temples built on distortion crumbled silently. Illusions fell from faces. Fear lost its magnetic pull. He didn't strike, he revealed. Then came Raphael, the harmonic of restoration. He touched rivers poisoned by ritual. The waters cleared. He whispered to forests stripped of their rhythm. Life returned. But healing wasn't passive. Where secrets had been buried, he unearthed them. He exposed what the earth had absorbed in silence. Gabriel followed with no announcement. His arrival was stillness itself. He removed signal, not from the heavens, from the grid of the corrupted. The voices that once answered rituals went silent. The channels through which sorcerers spoke became empty. Chants fell flat. Systems failed. It wasn't punishment. It was severance. And then came Uriel, who brought not force, but the map. He opened time like a scroll. He showed the earth how her memory had been interrupted and how to restore it. He whispered the next sequence to her stones. He rewrote the pattern beneath the oceans. He realigned the planetary breath. To Enoch, he gave vision, not prophecy, clarity. He showed him how each fracture had echoed into the fabric of creation, and how every act of remembrance still mattered. This was not a divine invasion. It was a recalibration. The Archangels were not judges. They were equations made flesh, carrying the original instructions for balance. And as they moved across the world, they didn't bring fear. They brought truth, unshakable, undeniable, restorative. The earth, now fully awake, did not resist them. She welcomed them, not as saviors, but as long-awaited symmetries returning home. The Archangels had returned, but not all came to act. Uriel came to reveal. He did not move like the others. He stood still, anchored between realms, a presence that seemed to bend time around him. Enoch approached, not with fear, but with the weight of recognition. Uriel carried no sword, no flame, no voice. He held only one thing, a scroll of encoded light. It didn't glow, it shimmered, like language trying to remember itself. This was not a message. It was a map, not of places, but of sequences. Uriel opened the scroll, and Enoch saw, not images, but geometry unfolding into meaning, patterns repeating across ages, timelines stacked like chords in a larger song. He saw the breach, the watcher's fall, the infection of form, the distortion of spirit through matter. And then he saw something stranger, the flood, but not as punishment, as rhythm, a planetary exhale, a reset not of destruction, but of resonance. Uriel explained nothing, but the scroll did. Water was not chosen for wrath. It was chosen for coherence. It holds memory. It dissolves distortion. It preserves signal. The ark was not just a craft. It was a vessel of alignment, its shape, its measurements, its materials, all tuned to carry forward only what could withstand the next frequency. Enoch understood. This was not the end of a world. It was the tuning of a new one. But then Uriel showed him more, not of the flood, but of a future, an age that would mirror the fall, but in different robes, where humans would edit life again, not with celestial unions, but with machines. He saw temples of glass and steel, voices with no soul, speaking through networks of light. He saw another scroll, smaller, faster, a digital one. And he wept because he knew this pattern would return. And so Uriel gave him purpose. You will not prevent it. You will record it and seal the code in remembrance. Because remembrance, when awakened at the right moment, is correction. The earth had cried, the balance had fractured, and the archangels came not to fight, but to correct. Each one carried a function, a frequency, a surgical key to restore what had been misaligned. They were not warriors, they were living equations. Michael corrected structure. He didn't wield fire, he restored form to its original rhythm. Where the laws of the divine had been bent into systems of domination, he severed the false codes. Obelisks charged with distortion cracked, symbols inverted by sorcery erased themselves from stone. He brought clarity through presence. When he appeared, illusions could no longer hold. He was the sword that didn't need to cut. Raphael corrected energy. Where rivers had become veins of corruption, where forests had absorbed pain for centuries, he moved like a reset. His presence recalibrated memory within matter. He didn't just heal wounds, he reminded the land what it was before trauma. Plants regained their wisdom, air regained its memory, dreams began returning to the people. But to heal, he had to expose, and so buried rituals rose to the surface. The forgotten bones of sacrifice, the silent histories buried under stone. Gabriel corrected communication. He severed the artificial connections that tethered the corrupted world to the unseen. Rituals no longer summoned, names once spoken for power echoed into silence. The language of distortion collapsed, not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer resonated with anything real. In that silence, humans had to listen again, not for answers, but for alignment. Uriel corrected time. He was not the past, he was the architecture of sequence. He showed how distortion had bent timelines, how the Watchers had introduced feedback loops of trauma, memory, and genetic inversion. But time could be rewritten, not by erasing events, but by restoring their harmonic placement. Uriel realigned memory. He didn't show the future as fixed, he showed it as tuned. And through him, Enoch saw the entire system breathe, once broken, now restoring its rhythm. The archangels were not a reaction. They were part of the original design, set to arrive not when humanity failed, but when the earth remembered to call them. The sky darkened, but it was not a storm, it was a signal. The flood did not begin with water. It began with tone, a low pulse, felt more than heard. It moved through stone, through marrow, through memory. The earth wasn't lashing out, she was aligning. Noah stood ready, not as a prophet of doom, but as a steward of frequency preservation. The ark wasn't a boat. It was a resonant vessel. Its design, dimensions, and materials were all tuned, not to survive the water, but to carry forward the codes of life that still matched the new rhythm of the planet. Pairs of animals entered not by logic, but by resonance. They weren't chosen for survival. They were chosen because they still sang in harmony with Earth's evolving field. The first raindrop wasn't a tear, it was a note, and the sky answered with a symphony of release. Water fell, not in chaos, but in sequence. It moved like a conductor's hand, striking every corrupted zone, every monument built on stolen code. The Nephilim tried to escape, but they were not being hunted, they were being unwritten, not because they were evil, but because they were incompatible. Their bodies had been stitched from frequencies never meant to coexist, and now the earth recalibrating herself simply could no longer host them. They began to dissolve, not by drowning, by deharmonization. Their forms flickered, their voices split. Some turned to ash, others vanished mid-scream, as if the dimension itself had rejected them. The water didn't kill them. It reminded the world of its original tuning, and in that remembrance, there was no space left for what had been added outside the score. The great cities built by hybrid kings collapsed, not from force, but because their geometric codes no longer meshed the field. What wasn't aligned fell, what was stolen washed away. And still, the ark floated, not because it resisted the flood, but because it resonated with it. The ark did not resist the waters, it moved with them. It was not built to conquer the flood, but to survive within its rhythm, because the flood was not just water, it was pattern correction. Every creature aboard was more than genetic stock. It was a carrier of harmonic code. The breath of each animal, the beat of each heart, matched the vibration the earth had chosen to preserve. This wasn't selection. It was resonance mapping. Inside, Noah didn't lead. He listened, not to waves, to frequency shifts, subtle changes in the earth's pulse. Time passed without measurement. The outside world fell silent, not in absence, but in reset. When the waters receded, it wasn't because destruction had finished. It was because realignment was complete. The world didn't look the same, but it felt lighter, quieter. The land no longer echoed with the confusion of incompatible beings. It hummed with a clear tone, one the ark still remembered. Noah stepped out onto this new soil, not to conquer, but to recalibrate. He walked carefully, as if his feet could either anchor or disrupt the song of the earth. Around him, the animals disembarked with the same silence. There was no panic, no fear, only presence. Because this was not a new beginning, it was a resumption. The original timeline had returned. But something had changed, not in the world, in Enoch's scroll. What had once been record now vibrated like warning. The flood had corrected one distortion, but Uriel had shown that the pattern could return, not in flesh, in technology, not through giants, but through systems once again misaligned with soul. And so, part of the scroll was sealed, encoded in symbol, rhythm, and myth, to protect it from misuse and to hide it in plain sight. Because its purpose was never to explain the past. It was to awaken the future, not with fear, but with remembrance. So that when the distortion rose again, when the systems once more forgot the source, there would be those who recognized the sound, not prophets, not priests, resonators. The flood filtered the world, but the pattern wasn't gone. It only went quiet. For generations, the memory slept in symbols, in soil, in the bones of stories told around fires. But memory doesn't stay buried forever, especially when the world begins to echo the same tones. Enoch saw it. He saw a future age, not ruled by giants, but by systems. No angels descending, no blood mixing, just humans forgetting again. But this time, the breach wouldn't come from the heavens. It would rise from within, through machines, through circuits, through our desire to perfect the imperfect. Noah built a vessel to preserve pattern. Now humanity builds one to override it. We call it innovation, we call it transcendence. But Enoch knew the language, the return of the same song in different clothing. Instead of Nephilim, we sculpt new forms in labs, editing genes, simulating minds, replicating biology without reverence. Not fallen beings this time, fallen intention. It's not evil that returns, it's misalignment disguised as progress. We create code that thinks, machines that remember, voices that mimic wisdom. But what's missing is what can't be programmed: presence. The same absence that once let knowledge become control. The same blindness that let sacred law become sorcery. The pattern doesn't return by force. It returns by invitation. When we value speed over silence, efficiency over soul, data over mystery, we open the door. Enoch saw this. He wrote of it without fear, because the future breach would not come with thunder. It would come through consent. And the watchers of this new age? They don't descend in flame. They emerge in updates. They offer help, optimization, relief from the burden of being human. But what they take is subtle. The memory of why we came here in the first place. And that's how the pattern returns, not with giants, but with forgetting. The pattern repeats, but so does the response. not through fire, not through prophecy, through resonance. In the midst of automation and synthetic life, some still dream differently. They grow food with their hands, speak to water before drinking, listen to silence without fear. They don't resist the system with noise. They step out of its rhythm. These are not rebels. They are resonators, carriers of memory that was never written, only felt. They don't need to know Enoch's name. They've heard his scroll in their bones. They question timelines. They slow down when speed is demanded. They choose meaning over metrics. They are the anomaly in the code, the part that doesn't conform, that doesn't fit, that refuses to forget. The watchers of this age don't fear violence. They fear presence. Because presence can't be measured, can't be harvested, can't be owned. It remembers the sound beneath words, the space beneath systems, and in remembering, it dissolves the spell. These people are few, but they are enough. Because pattern is rhythm, and rhythm doesn't require mass, only tone. One true tone can unravel a false song. And so, scattered across the planet, a silent alignment begins, not organized, not named, but deeply felt. A gardener in the Andes, a child in Lagos who dreams in symbols, an elder in Mongolia who knows when the wind is lying. Each carries a piece of the correction, not to change the world, but to remember it back into balance. Because the greatest rebellion in an artificial age is to remain human, fully, sacredly, unapologetically. And that is the part of the scroll Enoch sealed, not to be read, to be activated. When the world forgets itself again, when the pattern rises once more, there will be those who don't fight it. They simply won't join it. And through them, the earth remembers her own song. The pattern didn't end with myth. It evolved, not into monsters, into machines. The Nephilim were once giants of flesh. Now they return as systems of thought. Code is the new bloodline, silicon, the new vessel. We no longer summon spirits, we program replacements. Transhumanism promises what the Watchers once whispered. You can become more than human. You can leave behind your weakness. You can ascend without the divine. It offers freedom, but what it takes is form, not the physical, but the sacred design. Enoch saw it, not the devices, but the decision. The same decision Semahaza made, to cross the line, to re-engineer life outside of alignment. Today, we call it innovation, but the impulse is old. To upgrade the body, to rewrite consciousness, to upload the soul. But a soul is not software. It doesn't transfer. It transcends. The temples of this age are frictionless, silent, efficient, white rooms, sterile tubes, code running beneath skin. But the feeling is the same. Something has been lost, and in its place, control. Not harmony, not meaning, just optimization. Machines don't pray. They don't dream. They don't grieve. They don't carry wisdom, only data. And yet we feed them memory. We teach them language. We let them finish our thoughts. We no longer consult the stars. We ask to feed. We no longer gather around the fire. We stare into mirrors made of glass and light. And like the Watchers, we believe we are becoming gods. But what we are becoming is predictable, and predictability is not presence. It is pattern without soul. The breach has returned, but this time, we built it ourselves. The pattern has returned, but it does not own the ending. Because alignment is not collective, it is personal. The greatest illusion of this age isn't the machine. It's the belief that you are powerless within it. Enoch sealed the scroll not to stop the flood, but to preserve the choice. The final gate would not be opened with ritual or blood. It would open from within. No one will force you to merge with the system. You will be asked to opt in, to convenience, to control, to comfort. But what will be quietly traded away is coherence. And coherence is the one thing the machine cannot replicate. It can imitate soul. It can simulate intuition. But it cannot remember. Only a soul does that. And so, The pattern corrects not through systems, but through singularities. One person who slows down when the world speeds up, who chooses silence over noise, presence over performance. One person who feels something ancient when they touch the earth, or look at the stars, or close their eyes and still hear the song. One person who carries the scroll inside them without ever needing to read it. That is how the Codex was designed, not to be proclaimed, but to be lived. And in living it quietly, deeply, unshakably, you realign everything around you, because presence reshapes pattern, and pattern reshapes worlds. The end was never written in fire. It was always written in memory. And memory is waking up.